The night the storm came, Mara was not supposed to be in the woods. She was a field medic working for a small aid organization in a mountain border town called Velthorn. It was the kind of place that most people passed through without stopping, where the roads were narrow and the winters were long, and everyone minded their own business because there was simply too much work to do. Mara had come here 6 months ago to forget a life that had stopped making sense, a broken engagement, a family she could no longer talk to without an argument, a city full of people who looked at her with pity. Velthorn had felt like the cleanest kind of escape. She was returning from a late supply run when the rear axle of her truck cracked on the mountain road. The rain had turned the gravel into a river. She tried the radio and got static. She looked at the dark road ahead and made the decision that would change her life forever. She stepped out of the truck and walked. She found him 20 minutes later, under a fallen oak tree, half buried in mud and wet leaves. He was a small boy, no more than 5 years old. He had dark curls flattened against his forehead, and eyes that caught the light of her flashlight in a way that stopped her breath. Amber eyes, bright and sharp, like two small flames inside a face that was completely still. He was not crying, he was not calling for help. He was crouched low, with his shoulders pulled up and his jaw set, watching her the way a cornered animal watches the thing it is not sure about yet. Mara crouched down too. She kept her flashlight low so it would not blind him. She spoke slowly and quietly, the way she had learned to speak to frightened people in the field. She told him her name. She told him she was not going to hurt him. She told him she had warm food and dry blankets not far from here, and that he did not have to come with her if he did not want to, but that the rain was getting heavier and the temperature was dropping. She talked for 11 minutes. She counted, because she had nothing else to do except wait. Then he let her come closer. When she reached for him, he bit her hand hard enough to draw blood. She pulled back, pressed her sleeve against the wound, and did not move away. She simply waited again. I let her hand. Then he looked at her face. Then, slowly, he lifted his arms. She carried him all the way back to the outpost. He had no shoes. He had no identification. The clothes he was wearing were too thin and too small, and looked like they had not been washed in weeks. When she cleaned him up and treated a few scratches on his arms and legs, she found a scar on his left shoulder blade, old and uneven, the kind of mark that comes from a wound that was never properly cared for. She photographed it carefully and said nothing. She called every authority she could think of. Child Services sent a form and a case number. The local constable said there were no missing children reported in the area matching his description. She filed a report with the regional office. She waited. Nobody came. The boy would not speak, not a single word. He ate everything she put in front of him. He slept on the floor next to her bed, even when she arranged a proper cot for him. He followed her around the outpost with quiet, careful attention, always a few steps behind, always watching. She named him Eli, because he needed something to answer to. The first strange thing happened 3 weeks after she found him. She woke in the middle of the night to the sound of a low growl. She sat up immediately, because that sound was coming from inside the outpost, and she did not own a dog. She found Eli standing in the corner of the kitchen with his small body rigid, and his eyes fixed on the back door. The door handle was moving. She grabbed the nearest heavy object, crossed the room, and threw the door open. There was nothing there. Only darkness and rain, and, pressed into the mud near the step, a single footprint so large that Mara stood looking at it for a long time before she closed the door. She told herself it was a bear. She almost believed it. The second strange thing she could not explain away as easily. Eli's injuries healed too fast. Not quickly, the way a healthy child heals, but impossibly quickly, in ways that made her check her own records twice to make sure she had documented the wounds correctly. A deep cut on his chin was completely gone in 48 hours. Not scabbed, not fading, gone. She was a trained medic. She understood healing timelines the way other people understood weather. This was not normal. The third thing was the rabbit. She came outside one morning and found Eli sitting in the yard, holding a small brown rabbit in both hands. The animal was perfectly calm. It sat in his palms without struggling, without even trembling, with its eyes half closed. When Eli saw her watching, he gently set the rabbit on the ground. It did not run. It sat beside his feet like it belonged there. Mara went back inside. sat at the kitchen table, and thought for a long time. She was not a woman who jumped to impossible conclusions. She had a practical mind and a practical education, and she had spent years in the field making clear-eyed decisions under pressure. But she was also a woman who trusted what she observed over what she had been told was possible, and what she had observed over the last 2 months did not fit any category she had ever been given. She began to research quietly, carefully. She visited the old men at the tavern in town who told stories when they had been drinking long enough. She found archived records from the Regional Historical Society. She asked careful questions in careful places, and slowly, reluctantly, she began to understand what Eli might be, what the mountains around Velthorn might contain, what the packs were that the old men mentioned in lowered voices when they thought no one was paying attention. She did not run. She did not call anyone and tell them what she suspected. She did not distance herself from the boy who had bitten her hand and then lifted his arms to be carried. She stayed. That decision was hers entirely, made without anyone asking it of her, and it was the most important decision she would ever make. His name was Calum Dreven, and he had been searching for his son for 4 years. He was the Alpha King, which meant that his authority extended not over 1 pack but over 9, spread across the northern mountain ranges, in a territory that had been held and protected across more generations than most human institutions had existed. He was a large, serious man who carried silence the way other men carried confidence, the kind of person whose stillness in a room made other people unconsciously sit straighter without understanding why. He had not smiled in 4 years. The people close to him had stopped expecting it. His mate, Soren's mother, had died 3 days after giving birth. It had been a loss that Calum had absorbed the way stone absorbs cold, quietly and completely, until it became part of the material itself. His son, Soren, had been taken during a border raid when the boy was 14 months old. A rival faction had moved against the territory's southern edge, and in the chaos of the confrontation, the child was seized from the care of a senior pack member. The intention had been to use him as leverage. When Calum's forces pushed back and the camp was retaken, Soren was already gone. The trail ended at the river crossing 6 miles south. Calum had spent 4 years dismantling the faction that took his son. He had done it methodically and without rest, following every thread until there were no more threads left. He found his answers eventually. A smuggler confessed that the child had been handed to a human courier and moved across the border before the raid response had even begun. After that, the trail went cold in a world that was too large and too unmapped from his side of it. He came to Velthorn because of a scent. One of his scouts doing a routine perimeter run near the border had caught something on a woman passing through a town market 2 days east. Not the boy's scent directly, but something clinging to her, something adjacent, the faint biological trace that forms between a child of his kind and the person who has been their primary caregiver. The scout had not been certain enough to act. Calum had come himself. He found Mara at the outpost supply shed on a Tuesday evening, going through a crate of bandages by the light of a work lamp. She heard his footsteps on the gravel and turned around. He was standing at the edge of the light, and she looked at him, the way she had looked at the back door the night the handle was moving, with complete steadiness and not a trace of performance. She stepped sideways until she was standing in front of the shed door. He had not expected that. In 4 years of searching, in 9 packs and a dozen border towns and more conversations than he could count, no one had ever physically placed themselves between him and a destination. He said, "There may be a child here who belongs to me." She said, "Prove it." She brought a lamp outside and set it on the wooden table near the yard and told him to sit across from her. He sat. He was aware, distantly, that this was an unusual experience. She asked him questions about the child with the directness of someone who had prepared for exactly this conversation and was not going to be rushed through it. She asked about the scar on the boy's shoulder. Calum stopped moving when she said it. He described the scar exactly, the angle of it, the approximate depth, the way it had healed imperfectly, because the wound had happened during a skirmish, when the boy was with a pack member who was not able to give it proper attention in the moment. She asked about the boy's behavior around small animals. He explained it before she finished the question. He told her that children of his kind, before they were old enough for their nature to fully express itself, moved at a frequency that smaller animals recognized as something between familiar that it was not something taught, it was something carried. She did not write anything down. She listened the way experienced people listen, with her whole attention and without filling the silence. Then she asked about identifying marks. He told her about the birthmark, a small dark crescent shape behind the left ear. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and went inside. She came back with the boy. He had been asleep. He was wearing gray pajamas printed with small stars, and he was rubbing one eye with his fist, and his dark curls were pushed flat on one side from the pillow. He looked at the large stranger sitting at the table in the lamplight, and his hand slowly dropped from his eye. Something changed in his face. Not surprise, not fear, something quieter and older than either of those things. A recognition that lived somewhere below thought, the kind that does not need language or memory to function. He took 3 steps toward the table. Then he stopped and turned to look at Mara. She was crying. She had not made a decision to cry. It was simply happening, and she did not wipe her face or apologize for it. She crouched down to his level and told him in a steady voice that it was okay, that she was not going anywhere, that he could go say hello if he wanted to. Eli turned back to the man at the table. He crossed the remaining distance between them. He stopped at the edge of the chair and held both arms up. Calum lifted his son for the first time in 4 years. He held him carefully, the way a person holds something they thought they had lost permanently. He did not speak. He did not need to. The boy tucked his face against the side of Calum's neck and stayed very still. Mara sat back down at the table and looked at the lamp and waited until she trusted her voice again. The weeks that followed were complicated. Documentation was gathered and verified. Calum brought testimony and records. The human authorities in Velthorn had no legal claim to a child who had arrived without identification and been placed in no formal system. By the 6th week, everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved. Mara submitted her resignation from the outpost posting. She had no particular reason to stay in Velthorn anymore. She made arrangements to return to the city and began to pack. Calum came to the outpost on the morning she planned to leave. He brought Eli with him, and she understood that this was a kindness, giving her one more morning with the boy before she went. Eli climbed into her lap the moment he was close enough, and pressed his face into her shoulder, and stayed there. She held him for a long time without saying anything. When she finally set him down, Calum spoke. He told her that he owed her more than he had words to express. She told him she did not want anything. He said he knew that. He said that was part of why he was asking. He did not offer her a job. He did not make any arrangement that would feel like a transaction. He told her that his son had been through something difficult and long, and that in the months he had spent with her, something in the boy had found its footing. He had learned, in that small outpost in a mountain town, what it felt like to be safe. He told her that was entirely her doing. Then he asked her, plainly and without pressure, whether she would consider staying. She looked at the boy standing between them in his star pajamas, watching her with amber eyes that had stopped being guarded sometime in the last few months without her noticing exactly when. She looked at the man across from her, who had spent 4 years taking the world apart looking for his son, and was now sitting quietly in front of her waiting for an answer. She said she needed a week to think. He said he would wait. She took the week. She drove the mountain roads she had come to know. She called her sister, who told her she sounded different. Not sad, she said, just different. Mara thought about that for a long time. At the end of the week, she drove to the estate on the northern ridge where Calum had taken Soren, and she knocked on the front door, and when it opened, she said she had come to see Eli. The boy heard her voice from somewhere inside the house and came running. She caught him and held on, and somewhere in the house behind them, a door opened and closed, and footsteps came down a hall, and the life that had been quietly assembling itself around her, without her permission, continued to do so. Some things begin in a storm, under a fallen tree, with a frightened child and a woman who chose to stay. Everything that came after began there too.